April 15, 1943. The North Atlantic stretched black and endless beneath the bow of convoy HX-229. Waves smashed against steel hulls, a relentless rhythm, as if the ocean itself were warning of what was coming. Rain stung faces, wind tore through the rigging, and the men on deck clutched ropes with white-knuckled hands. Somewhere beneath the dark swells, unseen, German U-boats prowled, torpedoes ready to slice through the Allied lifeline. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Winterton scanned the horizon, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The crew shivered, not just from cold, but from the knowledge that the Atlantic had become a killing field. Every month, thousands of tons of supplies, food, tanks, ammunition, vanished beneath the waves. Submarines, invisible, unstoppable ghosts of steel. And yet tonight, something felt different. Winterton's radio crackled, a scratchy voice breaking the rhythm of waves and wind. Convoy rerouted. Repeat, new coordinates for safe passage. Orders like any other, but the tremor in his gut whispered, "This isn't ordinary." He lowered the binoculars and glanced at the map. Routes he had memorized for months had shifted. Suddenly, the Germans were chasing shadows. Across England, in a small, windowless room at Bletchley Park, a team of cryptographers hunched over machines that hummed and clattered like some monstrous heartbeat. Alan Turing, his hair falling into his eyes, leaned closer to the bombed machine. Sweat traced lines down his forehead. The Enigma code, the infamous unbreakable German cipher, was finally yielding. Minute by minute, the patterns emerged, and with each breakthrough, a silent revolution unfolded. By the time Winterton's convoy cut through the icy spray, German U-boats were already striking at empty waters, torpedoes plunging into darkness. Ships that had expected death now passed unmolested. You can almost hear the disbelief in the enemy command. Where are they? Why are our wolves finding nothing? In mere weeks, a once feared armada vanished from the Atlantic. The men on the decks, wrapped in oilskins, unaware of the cryptographic war raging far from the waves, sailed straight into safety. Yet behind the scenes, in rooms stacked with parchment and machinery, the greatest secret of the Battle of the Atlantic was being written, a weapon invisible, untouchable, and more deadly than any torpedo. And then a single, intercepted message changed everything. A German commander's report, typed in hurried script, revealed panic. The U-boats were confused, lost, floundering. Their confidence shattered in a whisper of code. Winterton felt the first hint of it as his ship cut through the Atlantic swell. They were winning without firing a single shot. But the Germans wouldn't surrender quietly. Not yet. Something bigger was coming, something that would test every ounce of courage and intelligence the Allies had. Bletchley Park, April 1943. You step into the room and it's a different world. Walls lined with tall whirring machines, wires snaking across floors, the smell of hot metal and ink. Every table is stacked with sheets of cipher, German naval messages in neat, looping script. The air hums with urgency. Every tick of the clock is a countdown to disaster or salvation. Alan Turing leans over the bomb machine, eyes darting across the rotating drums. "There," he whispers, voice almost drowned out by the clatter. A pattern emerges. A tiny flaw in the German Enigma routines, a predictable indicator hidden within a sea of randomness. The code that had terrorized the Atlantic for 3 years was finally yielding its secrets. One by one, messages decrypted, locations revealed, convoy positions, U-boat patrols. Nothing was hidden anymore. Behind Turing, Joan Clark adjusts her spectacles, scanning a line of text. Her fingers fly across sheets, marking which U-boats are where, when, and which convoy they plan to intercept. Every discovery feels like defusing a bomb mid-tick, the tension almost unbearable. One wrong interpretation and countless lives, and tons of vital cargo, could vanish beneath the waves. Back on the Atlantic, Winterton senses a subtle change. Reports from the bridge officers are strange: no torpedo sightings, no periscope slicing through waves, no distant silhouettes of prowling U-boats. For the first time in months, the ocean feels almost peaceful. Almost. But Winterton knows better. War never sleeps. Not here. Not ever. The beauty of Ultra was in its invisibility. No guns, no bombs, no parades, just knowledge. Knowledge could reroute convoys, position hunter-killer groups, anticipate wolfpack tactics before the Germans even thought of them. Within weeks, the tide of terror in the Atlantic reversed. The U-boats, once lords of the deep, became shadows, confused, desperate, hunted. Yet even in this triumph, the tension never eased. Admiral Dönitz in Berlin paced in disbelief, reading reports of missed targets. His submarines were disappearing, not to explosions, but to nothing. Orders came faster, patrols shifted, but nothing worked. The men he commanded began whispering of betrayal, of a ghost in the Atlantic, an invisible hand that anticipated every move. Back in Bletchley, Turing doesn't celebrate. Not yet. Every decrypted message is a battle won, but the war rages on. Every successful reroute is a victory, yes, but one mistake could undo weeks of careful calculation. You can almost feel the weight in the room, the pressure pressing down on the team. One slip, and the Atlantic could turn red again. And then a report arrives from the Admiralty, crisp, urgent. HX-229 has passed through the Wolfpack area completely unscathed. Silence fills the room. For the first time, the magnitude of their work hits them. They've changed the course of the Atlantic War. But somewhere deep beneath the waves, the Germans are regrouping. They won't surrender quietly. And that is when the next, deadliest challenge emerges. The wolf packs are adapting. The question is, can intelligence outpace instinct, cunning outmatch brute force fast enough? The North Atlantic in May 1943. Waves towered like dark fortresses, whitecaps snapping in the wind. Somewhere beneath the rolling chaos, German U-boats crept silently, torpedo tubes ready, crews tense. For 3 years, they had been the undisputed hunters of the Atlantic, stalking convoys like shadows. But now, something had changed. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, veteran commander of U-96, stared at the sonar reports in disbelief. "Where are they?" he muttered, voice tight. His Wolfpack, the instruments of terror that had sunk hundreds of Allied ships, were striking nothing. Missed convoys, empty sea lanes. Every engagement that should have been certain turned into frustration, confusion, and fear. The Atlantic, once their playground, had become a maze. On the bridge of U-96, men whispered. Sonar operators tapped at their instruments, double-checked periscope readings. Eyes scanning for shadows that never appeared. Orders from Dönitz came fast, impatient, anxious. Reroute, intercept, regroup. But nothing worked. The Allies seemed always one step ahead, and that's because they were. Far above, in cramped offices stacked with machines and cipher sheets, Bletchley Park hummed with life. Every decrypted Enigma message gave the Admiralty precise positions of wolf packs and their targets. Captain Winterton's convoy reports fed into this intelligence machine, like blood pulsing through a living organism. Every move the Germans made was anticipated. Every route they chose had already been accounted for. And yet the tension was unbearable. Ultra was powerful, yes, but it relied on secrecy. Not a word could escape. If the Germans realized Enigma had been cracked, the consequences would be catastrophic. Every sailor, every convoy, every ton of supplies depended on absolute silence. One careless slip, one spy, and the Atlantic could erupt into fire and wreckage again. Meanwhile, the German High Command was beginning to panic. Submarines went days without contact. Skirmishes failed to net a single ship, and morale began to fray. Experienced commanders argued over tactics, shouting at crews in desperation. The Atlantic had turned against them, not through fire but through invisible calculation, through anticipation, through knowledge no one could see. And in the midst of this, Winterton's crew began noticing something strange. Reports from nearby convoys indicated the U-boats were vanishing. The men didn't know why, but they could sense it, the shift. The predator was now the prey. Ships that had crossed the ocean under constant threat were now slipping through like ghosts, untouched. But the Germans were relentless. If they couldn't find the convoys, they would adapt. New patrols, new strategies, new wolfpack formations. And every failed attack only made them more dangerous. Ultra had given the Allies a chance, yes, but it was a battle of wits, nerve, and timing. The Atlantic was far from quiet, and the next clash promised to be more deadly than anyone imagined. June 1943. A cold fog hung over the Atlantic, clinging to decks and periscopes like a ghost. Convoy ONS-5 moved slowly, ships creaking as they cut through icy swells. Crewmen huddled in rain-soaked uniforms, scanning the endless gray horizon, ears straining for the distant ping of sonar or the deadly whoosh of a torpedo. They had no idea that the secret of their survival had been forged hundreds of miles away in a quiet room full of whirring machines. Inside Bletchley Park, the cryptographers worked relentlessly. Messages decrypted that morning revealed the positions of 30 German U-boats, scattered across the convoy's projected path. Alan Turing, Joan Clark, and their team had mapped every likely attack point, every ambush, every Wolfpack tactic, and the Admiralty had acted immediately, rerouting ships and deploying hunter-killer groups. The first encounter came at dawn. From the bridge of HMS Leamington, the sonar operator called out sharply, "Contact, bearing 45. Depth charges were readied, crews braced for the explosion. But when they reached the coordinates, the U-boat was gone. Rerouted, misled, foiled by intelligence no one could see. Confusion reigned in the German ranks, whispers of impossible drifting across radio waves, intercepted by Allied listening posts. Korvettenkapitän Lehmann Willenbrock cursed under his breath. Every convoy he pursued now seemed like smoke in the fog, always there but always slipping through his fingers. Orders from Dönitz became frantic, more erratic. Experienced crews, once confident and ruthless, began questioning themselves. Could their codes have been broken? Could the Allies somehow know where they were before they even moved? Meanwhile, Winterton's convoy pressed on, unaware of the chess game being played beneath the waves. From the deck, he could see the sun breaking through fog banks, illuminating the cold, restless water. The Atlantic, vast and deadly, had become an invisible battlefield. Every successful reroute, every convoy that arrived safely, was a silent victory. Yet no one aboard these ships understood how close the line between survival and annihilation had been drawn. The turning point came during the final week of June. A Wolfpack, previously feared for its efficiency and ruthlessness, was intercepted before it could reach the convoy. Depth charges exploded, U-boat crews panicked, and ships that had once been easy prey now passed unharmed. Across Berlin, Dönitz's confidence faltered. The mighty Atlantic fleet of U-boats was no longer untouchable. It was being systematically dismantled, not by brute force but by strategy, intellect, and secrecy. And the realization hit the cryptographers. Ultra was not just a tool, it was a weapon of unprecedented power. It could save thousands of lives, turn the tide of the Atlantic War, and do it all without a single Allied torpedo fired in anger. But every victory carried a shadow. The Germans could adapt, could change their codes, could discover the secret. The war below the waves was far from over. And yet, for the first time in years, the Atlantic convoys sailed not with fear but with cautious hope. The wolf packs were still out there, but now they were the hunted. The question lingered, how long before the Germans would catch on? And when they did, would Ultra still be July 1943? The Atlantic was deceptively calm, sun glinting off the waves, gulls circling overhead. From the deck of HMS Leamington it almost looked peaceful, almost ordinary. But the sailors knew better. Every shadow on the water, every distant swell could hide a U-boat ready to strike. Yet for the first time in months the silence was telling. The predator had become the prey. Back at Bletchley Park, the team moved with quiet urgency. Each intercepted German message confirmed the same pattern: failed attacks, missed convoys, lost opportunities. Admiral Dönitz's reports grew increasingly frantic, commanders questioning themselves. Ultra had made German submarines vanish, not physically but strategically. The Allies were everywhere the U-boats weren't, always one step ahead. Winterton, standing on the wet deck, could feel the tension slowly lifting. He didn't know why the convoys were suddenly safer, only that they were. Crewmen joked quietly among themselves, a nervous humor born of months spent fearing torpedo strikes. Every successful day at sea reinforced what Turing, Clark, and the team had achieved behind closed doors. A war fought in silence, with minds instead of guns. The scale of the victory was staggering. Over 30 U-boats were neutralized, either destroyed by rerouted hunter-killer groups or left stranded, missing their targets entirely. Convoys that had been sitting ducks were suddenly untouchable. The Atlantic, once a graveyard, had become a corridor of life. Supplies, troops, tanks, and fuel flowed uninterrupted, a lifeline the Germans could no longer strangle. Yet the victory was invisible. No parades, no medals, no explosions greeted it. The world didn't know the Atlantic had been saved not by torpedo or depth charge, but by the brilliance of a handful of cryptographers working in obscurity. Ultra had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. Information was more deadly than steel, foresight more lethal than firepower. But even in triumph, danger lingered. The Germans, desperate and cunning, were adapting. New codes, new patrols, new wolf-pack formations were being plotted in Berlin, and somewhere in the Atlantic, new U-boats prowled the waves. The invisible war beneath the ocean was far from over. One wrong move, one intercepted message falling into enemy hands could undo everything. And so, while the Allies celebrated quietly in the halls of Bletchley Park, the Atlantic held its breath. The ocean waves washed over the steel hulls, relentless and eternal, as if warning that victory, no matter how clever, could never be absolute. For now, though, Ultra had won. The German U-boats had vanished overnight, not through brute force, but through brilliance, secrecy, and sheer intellectual audacity. And in the hearts of those sailors and cryptographers, a quiet sense of awe began to grow. They had done the impossible. But one lingering question remained. Could the invisible weapon hold against the next German strategy? Or would the Atlantic once again become a graveyard of ships? July 1943. Berlin, sweltering under summer heat, felt claustrophobic. In the Reich Chancellery, Admiral Karl Dönitz paced back and forth, the weight of the Atlantic War pressing on him like a vice. His once confident U-boat fleet was faltering. Reports piled up on his desk, failed interceptions, missed convoys, crews frustrated, morale collapsing. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic were now shadows of their former selves. Korvettenkapitän Lehmann Willenbrock slammed his fist on the map table, the lines and coordinates of his U-boats scratched with frantic pen marks. "Where are the convoys? Why are our attacks failing?" he demanded. Officers shifted uneasily, sharing uneasy glances. They had no answer, only confusion. The Atlantic, once predictable and lethal, had become a nightmare. Every missed strike was a blow to pride and strategy. The Germans had always relied on secrecy and stealth, and now that advantage had been stolen from them. Ultra, the invisible hand guiding the Allies, had turned the hunter into the hunted. Dönitz could only guess at what was happening. Were their codes compromised? Was there a spy in the Admiralty? His gut told him that something beyond ordinary strategy was at work. Meanwhile in England, Bletchley Park hummed with quiet determination. Turing, Clark, and the team didn't celebrate. They couldn't. Each decoded message was a reminder that failure could come at any moment. One miscalculation, one slip of secrecy, and the Germans would adapt, retaliate, and the Atlantic would flood with the wreckage of Allied ships once more. But the results spoke for themselves. Convoys passed through previously deadly stretches of ocean without a scratch. Hunter-killer groups intercepted U-boats precisely where they expected them, leaving German crews bewildered and demoralized. The Atlantic War had shifted in a way that no torpedo, no gun, no convoy escort could have achieved alone. And yet a question lingered like smoke in the cold sea air. How long could Ultra maintain this edge? The Germans were clever, ruthless, and adaptive. For every advantage gained, there was always the risk of exposure. The chess game beneath the waves was far from over, and the next move could be catastrophic. But for now, the Allies had done the impossible. They had made German U-boats vanish overnight. Knowledge had triumphed over brute force. Silence had triumphed over terror. And somewhere on the ocean, sailors whispered in awe at the strange, invisible power that had saved them. A shadow of triumph and tension hung over both sides, because in war no victory lasts forever. Even as Ultra reshaped the Atlantic War, the human toll was impossible to ignore. In the cramped, rain-lashed mess decks of convoys, sailors huddled under oilskins, clutching mugs of tepid coffee, muscles stiff from endless hours on deck. They didn't know that their survival depended not on skill or luck, but on the genius of people thousands of miles away, in quiet, windowless rooms. On U-96, the crew felt the first whispers of hopelessness. Sub-Lieutenant Erich Schulze stared at the empty horizon, fingers gripping the rail. For months, the wolf pack had hunted with terrifying efficiency, striking fear into Allied sailors. Now the ocean seemed hostile in a new way. It mocked them with silence. Orders came from Berlin to pursue, but every attack failed. Every encounter ended with nothing but missed opportunities. Fear replaced confidence. Back at Bletchley Park, the cryptographers carried a different kind of burden. Each decrypted message, each successful reroute, saved hundreds of lives. But they also carried the weight of responsibility. One misinterpretation could send an entire convoy to the depths of the Atlantic, torpedoes exploding amid screams and fire. The quiet triumph of intellect was always paired with the constant reminder: lives hung in the balance. Alan Turing rubbed his temples as a new batch of messages rolled in. The code was unyielding, ever-changing. Every day brought a fresh challenge, new permutations, and fresh calculations. The team worked around the clock, the hum of machinery their constant companion. No one cheered. No one rested. Victory was measured in survival, in quiet reports, in convoys arriving intact instead of sunk. Meanwhile, Winterton walked the decks of his convoy ship, watching the men go about their routines. They joked quietly, but the tension lingered. Each wave that slammed against the hull reminded them of what had come before. They survived, yes, but survival in the Atlantic never came easily, and it had been Ultra that tipped the balance. And yet, even as they sailed safely through the Atlantic, the unseen enemy waited. The U-boats had vanished, but for how long? Would the Germans adapt? Would the brilliance of Bletchley Park continue to outpace their cunning? The answer would decide the fate of thousands more, and perhaps the entire war in the Atlantic. A silent war, fought with codes and paper and sweat, had changed the course of history. But every victory carried a shadow, the knowledge that at any moment the balance could tip again. By late summer 1943, the Atlantic had begun to breathe differently. Convoys moved with a confidence that had been impossible just months before. Sailors no longer scanned the waves with the same terror. The ocean still demanded respect, but fear had been replaced with cautious optimism. Somewhere in that endless expanse of water, German U-boats prowled, but their advantage was gone. In Bletchley Park, the cryptographers understood what they had achieved. Ultra was more than intelligence, it was a revolution. The war could now be fought in silence, behind walls of calculation, with machines and human ingenuity as the sharpest weapons. Every convoy rerouted safely, every U-boat intercepted or misdirected, was a proof of concept. Knowledge could conquer the sea itself. Yet for all the triumph, the team never relaxed. They were acutely aware that the Germans were adapting, refining codes, and hunting for the invisible hand that had thwarted them. One slip could undo months of effort. Every new message brought tension alongside relief. Every day at Bletchley Park a careful dance with danger. Across the Atlantic, Winterton and his crew began to sense a shift, not just in strategy but in morale. Allied commanders, emboldened by the results of Ultra, took more calculated risks. Convoys moved faster, closer together, with better coordination. The Germans were still out there, but their shadow had lost its bite. Victory was not complete, but the momentum had decisively shifted. For the men aboard the convoys, the war remained a visceral experience. The smell of salt and oil, the roar of wind and waves, the tension in every sonar ping. But there was now a quiet force protecting them, an invisible guardian working tirelessly behind the scenes. ensuring that the Atlantic, once a graveyard, became a lifeline. And in Berlin, frustration turned to desperation. Dönitz and his commanders could not comprehend how their mighty U-boats were failing without direct confrontation. Whispers of betrayal and spies circulated among officers, a growing fear that they were no longer masters of the ocean they had once dominated. Ultra's true power was its invisibility. It saved lives, won battles, and altered the war's trajectory, all without a single gun fired in the open. Knowledge had become the deadliest weapon of all, and the Allies had mastered it. But even as the Atlantic grew safer, one question remained, one that would haunt both sailors and cryptographers alike. How long could a secret remain unbroken? How long could the wolves be kept at bay before they returned with renewed cunning? The Atlantic had been changed forever, but the war below the waves was far from over. And somewhere, lurking in the depths, the next challenge waited, autumn 1943. The Atlantic had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Convoys slid through fog and waves with fewer losses, but the men never let their guard down. They knew the ocean could turn deadly in an instant. Every creaking deck, every whistle of wind, every distant splash kept them alert. Survival had a new ally now, knowledge, but it was invisible, intangible, and utterly unpredictable. At Bletchley Park, the work never stopped. Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, and the team had developed a system that could anticipate almost every German move. Each decrypted Enigma message was a revelation, a glimpse into the enemy's strategy, a way to stay one step ahead. Convoys were rerouted, wolf packs ambushed, and the Atlantic became a chessboard where every piece moved exactly as predicted, except the enemy didn't know the rules. Back on the ocean, Winterton and his officers noticed the subtle effects. Patrols intercepted U-boats with uncanny precision. Ships that would have been easy targets in previous months now sailed safely through the heart of what had once been a killing zone. The crews whispered about luck, about fate, but it wasn't luck. It was intellect, secrecy, and strategy. Ultra had turned the tide without a single explosion on their decks. Meanwhile in Berlin, frustration had reached a fever pitch. Dönitz's fleet had been reduced in effectiveness dramatically, with U-boats missing their targets or falling into carefully laid traps. Experienced commanders bickered, desperate to explain the inexplicable. "Our codes are secure," they claimed, but the evidence told a different story. The Allies were always one step ahead. Something, somewhere, had broken the rules of war. The beauty of Ultra lay in its silence. There was no fanfare, no celebration, no medals pinned for these victories. The Atlantic was still a dangerous place, but the invisible war had begun to dominate the visible one. Knowledge was now as lethal as torpedoes, as decisive as artillery. And the men in Bletchley Park, the mathematicians, linguists, and engineers, carried the fate of thousands of sailors on their shoulders. Yet even as Ultra reshaped the oceanic battlefield, the cryptographers were haunted by one truth. The Germans were clever. They adapted quickly, experimented, and might one day uncover the secret. Every success carried the tension of exposure. The invisible war, as effective as it was fragile, held together by secrecy, calculation, and human ingenuity. And as the convoys moved forward, gliding across the black waves, one question lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Could this invisible weapon continue to outpace the relentless cunning of the enemy? Or would the Atlantic, once again, become a graveyard? The Atlantic had been won for now, but the war beneath the waves was far from over. By the winter of 1943, the Atlantic had transformed. Convoys moved with a confidence that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Ships once sitting ducks now traversed thousands of miles with remarkable safety. Sailors began to whisper stories of luck, but behind the luck was Ultra, the invisible hand that had changed the rules of naval warfare forever. At Bletchley Park, the cryptographers felt the weight of their achievement but never allowed themselves to rest. Alan Turing adjusted the settings on a bomb machine, fingers deftly tracing the moving drums. Joan Clark cross-checked decrypted German naval messages with Admiralty reports. Every successful reroute, every U-boat misdirection proved their work's staggering impact. Intelligence, patience, and brilliance had outmaneuvered brute force. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dönitz faced a humiliating truth. The once feared U-boat armada was now a shadow of its former self. Crews feared the unseen enemy more than storms or depth charges. Every failed interception, every missed convoy became a stain on his command. German morale had fractured. The Atlantic, their domain for years, was no longer theirs to command. Back on the convoys, sailors like Winterton noticed the subtle shift. The silence on the horizon was no longer ominous. Waves continued to crash, wind tore at oilskins, but the constant dread that had haunted every crossing had lifted, replaced by cautious optimism. Lives were being saved, tonnage was being delivered, and entire campaigns depended on the invisible power of Ultra. The true genius of the operation was never in sight. No torpedo, no gun, no battlefield display could reveal it. Its triumph was quiet, secret, and complete. Knowledge had triumphed over brute force. Calculation had conquered fear. And the Battle of the Atlantic had a new kind of hero: mathematicians, linguists, and cryptographers who had never set foot on a ship but whose work saved thousands of lives. And yet the shadow of uncertainty remained. The Germans would adapt. Codes would evolve. The invisible war was fragile, held together by secrecy, intelligence, and the relentless dedication of a few extraordinary minds. The stakes had never been higher, and the Atlantic would always demand vigilance. For now, though, the ocean belonged to the Allies. German U-boats had vanished overnight, not through combat but through genius. And in that silent triumph, the war had been changed forever. The ocean roared, steel hulls cut through waves, and the unseen hand of intelligence ensured survival. Ultra had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not visible at all, and that the mind, more than any torpedo, can reshape history.